How would you react? You're born into one of the most powerful families in the world, but instead of being lifted up, you're cast aside, dismissed, ignored, treated like an afterthought. As a child, Claudius suffered from a limp and a speech impediment, physical challenges that were beyond his control. But instead of being met with love or support, his mother, Antonia, called him a monster of a man, not completed, but merely begun by nature. Let that sink in. His mother, the one person who should have loved him unconditionally, made him feel like he was barely human. Then there was his grandmother, Livia, who openly showed her disappointment in him, as if he were some sort of cosmic mistake. Now, can you imagine how damaging that would be to a young mind? Claudius was a child, and in that context, he absolutely deserves sympathy. He didn't ask for these physical challenges, and yet he was made to feel like he was a failure before he ever had a chance to succeed. But here's where we draw the line. His family doesn't deserve a shred of sympathy for how they treated him. They judged him based on the cruel standards of their society, dismissing him simply because he didn't fit their image of a perfect Roman leader. It's one thing to have societal pressures. It's another thing entirely to tear down a child because of them. They didn't just blame him for things beyond his control. They hated him for it. And that's absolutely vile. That's the real injustice here. Claudius was a child who could have thrived with just a little bit of support, but instead, he was subjected to emotional abuse from the people who should have protected him. It's a sick cycle, and it's one we still see today. How many kids are blamed for things they can't control, whether it's their appearance, their abilities, or even their mental health? And here's the truth. Blaming people for things they can't control is one of the quickest ways to ruin them. When you blame someone for things they can't change, you're not just being cruel. You're pushing them toward a victim mindset. And that's where things get ugly. Claudius, for much of his early life, let that victim mindset consume him. He blamed his mother, his grandmother, even his entire family for his lack of achievements. And who could blame him at first? As a child, he was essentially programmed to believe he was a failure. But that's the real tragedy of falling into the victim mentality. You start to believe that you're powerless, that everything bad in your life is someone else's fault. And once you start thinking like that, you stop trying. Claudius could have spent his entire life using his family's cruelty as an excuse to stay in the shadows. And that's exactly what a lot of people do today. We all know someone like this. Someone who's always got a reason why they can't move forward. Maybe it's their parents. Maybe it's their upbringing. Maybe it's some societal disadvantage. But here's the thing. At some point, you have to take responsibility for your own life. It's easy to blame others for your circumstances, but it's also a trap. When people start blaming you for things you can't control, you could easily adopt a victim complex, whether it's their position of power or their ability to help you. You're giving away your own power. You're choosing to stay stuck in a cycle of resentment, and that cycle, it's suffocating. People who do this are exhausting. They bring negativity to every conversation, always pointing fingers, always playing the victim. And let's be honest, it's not just annoying, it's toxic. But here's the flip side. As much as we can sympathize with Claudius for how he was treated, There comes a point where he has to take responsibility for his own life. And the same goes for anyone who falls into the victim mindset. Yes, trauma is real. Yes, people can be treated unfairly. But if you let that define you, if you let it control your entire narrative, then you're just perpetuating your own misery. Claudius spent years blaming his family, his speech impediment, his limp, everything and everyone except himself. And because of that, he missed out on opportunities. He stayed in the background. He avoided public roles. He let his trauma turn him into a prisoner of his own mind. The real problem with blaming others for things beyond their control is that it stunts your growth. You stop looking for ways to improve because you've convinced yourself that everything wrong in your life is someone else's fault, and that's where things get messy. Sure, Claudius's family was cruel, and they deserve all the blame for that. But Claudius, in his early years, let their treatment justify why he wasn't achieving anything. And that's what happens when people adopt a victim mindset. They find a way to rationalize their lack of progress. They'll point to their upbringing, their circumstances, their environment. But at the end of the day, it's just an excuse. It's a way to avoid doing the hard work of self-reflection and personal growth. But let's circle back to the real villains in this story. Claudius's family. They're the ones who set him on this path in the first place. They made him believe that his limitations were insurmountable, that his flaws were something to be ashamed of. And that's the ultimate cruelty. Because once someone internalizes that kind of blame, it's incredibly hard to break free. Claudius spent years believing that he would never amount to anything because that's what his family drilled into him. But here's where the story takes a turn. When he was suddenly thrust into power as emperor, all those so-called limitations disappeared. He was capable, he was intelligent, and he was far more effective than anyone had ever expected. And that's the real proof that the victim mindset is just a self-imposed prison. Once Claudius let go of that, he thrived. Blaming others for things they can't control doesn't just hurt them. It chains them to a narrative that keeps them from moving forward. It warps their sense of self, just like it did with Claudius. It makes them believe they're powerless, when, in reality, they're the only ones who can change their situation. And here's the truth. When people blame others, they're avoiding responsibility. It's easier to point fingers than it is to look in the mirror. But the more you blame others, the more you give away your own power. You stop seeing yourself as someone who can change your life, and instead, you become a passive observer in your own story. And that's the worst kind of existence. So stop blaming others for things they can't control. It's unfair, it's cruel, and it's a one-way ticket to dysfunction. Claudius's story is a perfect example of how destructive this can be. His family was reprehensible, no doubt, but once he stopped letting their cruelty define him, he became one of Rome's most successful emperors. The lesson here is clear. Taking responsibility for your own life is the only way to break free from the cycle of blame. The moment you stop blaming others, the moment you start taking control, is the moment you find real power. And once you've tasted that power, you'll never go back.